So welcome everyone. This is A Greater Pattern. It's on threat items and campaign building, and I'm Morgan Weeks. This presentation is going to cover some campaign building tips on how to have a sandbox campaign, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, but also how to incorporate threat items and specifically their key knowledges into that, in addition to some just general campaign advice, which may be repetition for many people, but it may also be new. So please let me know if you have any questions in the chat as we go forward. So let's get going. To start this off with a quote, game mastering is conducting a psychological warfare against your players through the medium of the game and their characters. I've said this before and I'll say it again, but I'll also explain kind of what that means. It's about setting the stakes. And as the game master, you're in charge of the setting, and that means you get to challenge the players, but also offer the rewards and deliver the consequences for their actions. And those really are important to go hand in hand. But what you should be doing as the game master is also learning about your players and their characters so that you can have them care about the setting. You need to learn their weaknesses of the players and then exploit them so that you can bring them deeper into the setting and have the events in the story have more meaning to them. This is about building something a little bigger than that and really bringing them in. The best way to do that is to learn about them as people. And it may sound a little cruel, and in some ways it is, but this isn't about bringing personal trauma into it. That's never the goal for anything. It's about knowing their buttons and how to push them to elicit a certain response to the story as it's going forward. So it's important in your story to have meaningful consequences, and a challenge gives a greater meaning to their victory. If your players always win, and it's always easy, as we all know, then it doesn't really have any meaning to it. The players don't always have to win. Not every encounter has to end in victory. This doesn't necessarily mean player death or they lose the fight. It's they don't always achieve all their goals. Maybe they can't achieve all their goals. There's some time-limited goals, and they have to pick which then they want to do, and that's a difficult choice. Or in trying and struggling, they fail. It might not be a complete failure. They might achieve something, but in the end, they can still lose. But in doing so, you shouldn't be arbitrary about that. You always have to play fair. You can play dirty, but you should always play fair. And along those lines, considering implementing the ideas of failing forward and success with cost as well in your game. I talk about those briefly in a recent post on my blog. You can go look at that, or we can discuss it later on if those aren't familiar concepts to you, and how to implement them in Earth. So to get started, as we all know, the first thing you do is have session 0. And this is really where you get together with your players, they build characters, you talk about the game. From the game master, one of the most important things is to find out what your players want out of the game. Talk to them, ask them. The characters they make are going to tell you something about what they want. This also goes into asking the players what they want. One of the things that really works towards that is making a survey ahead of time. We have lots of technology to make this easy, with like SurveyMonkey, but back in the day, I would create a paper survey that asked questions on what players want out of a game. I would have a few different themes like action, romance, exploration, intrigue, and I would have them rate what they wanted out of those from 1 to a 5, where I may give them so many points to put into a category, and that would tell me what each player wanted out of the game. That may change as the game goes forward, but this isn't something I plan for. And of course, as I mentioned before, it never hurts to ask someone directly. We're all adults, we all want to have fun, and communication is the most important thing at the table, even if it's one of the hardest things to do. Another important thing out of session 0 as the game master is, what do you want out of the game? Your wants are just important as the player's wants, and maintaining your interest in the game means that you're going to be more dedicated to it, and it's going to go longer. It's going to be more successful if it's something that everyone involved actively wants to keep going. I've had this kind of burnout from personal experience where the players may have loved the game, but I wasn't really into it, and after a while, it suffered because of it. And it took me a while to readjust the game to being something that I also wanted. So use all this information that your players have given you, their characters, and what you want, and use that to integrate the characters into the setting. Well, this is true for every game. This is especially true for Sandbox, because motivation and figuring out what it is they're going to be doing can be difficult to predict at times. So these are all tools to help with that. So when you have these pieces, that's what you're going to build your campaign around. So when you're building this campaign, you want to think about the story you want to tell from those pieces. You also want to see about the story your players are telling. They tell you they want to play. So through their actions, as the story unfolds, and as they're from their characters, they're going to tell you the kind of story they want to be in. You should adapt to that and realize what's happening at the table. But when you're planning your campaign, it can be helpful to break this down into some discrete events you want to have happen. Maybe you have this one scene that's really cool in your head and you'd like to see that play out. Maybe there's some key events that, while the ending you don't know what it is yet, you do know that these events are going to happen and the player's actions will affect that ending naturally. Dividing your bigger story into these discrete events can help you with planning how they're going to happen and how they're going to go down. And I suggest you then get a map of Barse or whatever location you're playing in. And then from there, you figure out what other pieces in the setting are set in motion towards that story. So you'll have the events you want to have happen, what other pieces are moving towards those events, kind of get an idea of what's going on. It can be useful to make a list. And then on your map, you note the location where those events are taking place, or events that have to take place in a certain location. There's also going to be critical events that aren't fixed to a particular location, and make note of those well that these are flexible. So from here, you're going to get the hubs of activity within your campaign. Here's the places where you really want players to be traveling to for some reason or another, and you have some events that you can move around as necessary and keep those in your back pocket, which are going to be pretty useful. We're going to bring in thread items and how to tie them into this kind of plan you've created. So when you give players a sandbox, they can do whatever they want, but if you give them thread items, they're going to chase those key knowledges. This is something that you can absolutely exploit and take advantage of. You know, most people would call that a railroad, but this is a railroad they want to be on. So look at your map, see the events you've got when you start putting together the key knowledges and deeds for those thread items, and see what overlap you can get between the story and the key knowledge that you have. Then you can use the key knowledge and the deeds that you have to advance that story. Since you control the key knowledge, that means to a certain extent you control where the players are going. You can connect the key knowledge to make it integral to the story. You can have these key knowledges reveal some aspect of the story. That key knowledge may illuminate something from the past, or you can have, through achieving and learning that key knowledge, greater events are revealed. The process of learning it advances the story itself through external events. It can be advancing the story reveals the piece of key knowledge, or it can even foretell of oncoming badness. So they're in this location learning this key knowledge, and they see some events and maybe interact with them that aren't directly part of the story as they know it yet, but it gives hints to other things that are happening in the future. So an example of this is during one of my games, I sent my players into the Servos jungle, searching for some key knowledge and other events. And while they were there, they encountered, of course, all sorts of things trying to kill them, but they also discovered Therans performing an excavation on a massive stone airship, and that was curious to them. And then as they were leaving the Servos jungle, they saw it take off and fly away. And later on in the story, they re-encountered that airship and the people who had recovered it, and that was when they realized, oh, this was part of something much bigger. And you can use the fact you control where the players are going to reveal these plot pieces, offer some foreboding information. The Gamemasters Guide doesn't really offer a lot of information on introducing the campaign. There is no right number of thread items to hand out. I know D&D 3rd edition and 4th edition were pretty clear on here's the resources your players should have at this level. Earthdawn doesn't have that. There's no recommended number at all. I don't have any advice to tell you on what they should have. I know the example characters provided with the Game Master screen have some thread items in there. You can use that, but I don't consider that much of a guideline. The right number, whatever your group feels is the right number for their style of play. It could be a lot, it could be few. It doesn't even have to be representative for everyone else in the world. Your player characters are as special as you want them to be and as different as you want them to be. I do suggest, however, you introduce thread items gradually so the group isn't overwhelmed. They'll have too many threads to follow in terms of key knowledge to follow up on. They won't really get to learn those thread items. They won't become special to them. If every person in a 5-person group gets a new thread item, you'll know what key knowledges they're going after. You just don't necessarily know the order they're going after, which in a sandbox campaign means you're not controlling where they're going. You just know the destinations that'll be there eventually and the events that can take place in those locations when they get there. Story controls thread item advancement. That's kind of key. they don't get access to these powers until they complete the story elements for them. And this means that even powerful threat items have a limited impact in that they can't freely advance them all the way as soon as they get the threat item. They have to go through these steps, and maybe they can't even accomplish a key knowledge yet. They don't know where to go look, they don't have any ideas. So that provides a natural break on how much impact an individual threat item can have on the game. A general piece of advice is if players miss a threat item due to the unfolding events, you can work it in later. It can be very disheartening to the people at the table if you grind the story to a halt just to make sure that your threat item shows up. And if your players decide they don't want a threat item, there might be a reason they don't want it. Maybe they don't trust it, they think it's cursed, or maybe the cost to get it is too high. There can be all kinds of reasons, but if they decide to pass on a new magical toy, there's probably a reason they decided to pass on it. So while I talk about using threat items to tell the story, at the same time, not every threat item has to be designed specifically for a character. They can be, sometimes I've introduced threat items that were almost designed to be traded to someone else, as the players didn't know quite what to do with it, but they were going to encounter someone later on who wanted that threat item. And so it was useful for trade in that purpose. Or it might just be, I'm going to give this to you guys, and maybe someone will like it. If it's the case, if it's used for trade, then obviously the key knowledges don't need to tie into the story as much if they decide to pursue that threat item as their own, or they even trade away a threat item you were going to use to tell the story. In the latter case, well, that just means you can substitute in a different threat item with the same basic layout of key knowledge. They'll never know. But if they decide to pursue it, you can use that to tell a side plot, you can integrate it into the story. This is one of the few aspects of the game that I'm trying to get at, is you really have control over the player's actions and what they're doing. Absolutely take advantage of it. Now, a reason to introduce the threat items that aren't specifically defined for a character is, for some people, it can make the setting feel less like a walled garden that exists only for their convenience. Of course, some people want to sell threat items. There is no suggested price for a threat item. We've been pretty clear that they aren't, outside of Haven, really considered a commodity in that sense. The amount of work that goes into creating them is simply too great to sell them casually. Now, there's nothing wrong with doing that in your game. You absolutely should if you want to, but it's simply not a thing that we inherently advocate as part of being authentic to the setting. So now we'll get into actually designing, some advice for designing threat items at your table. As I alluded to, there's some different philosophies for designing a threat item. You can design them specifically for a character. You can design them for the campaign in general. A good example of that is the Blades adventure, the Blades of Karafad, which is a fantastic example of everything I'm talking about here, and a great adventure in and of itself. You can also take threat items from official content. That is a popular option because they've clearly had some thought put behind them in what they do. There isn't a right answer here. Again, it's whatever works best for you and your game and how much you like to and want to tinker with what's out there. The Gamemasters Guide and Companion have extensive examples of threat items to use, and the Gamemasters Guide also has guidelines for designing your own. My blog has over 100, but the warning is a lot of those were kind of experimental as I was trying different things out and just showing my work. So some of them may be overpowered as I wanted to push the limits and see where it breaks with various effects, which goes into, if something's not working, talk with your players. Sit down and figure out what it is that didn't work. Why is it, disrupting the game to have this in play? If a threat item's too powerful, be direct and say, look, I made a mistake with this. Let's, reel it back in so it's not disrupting play for everyone else, and be open about it. Have everyone involved in the conversation and figure out what works best for the table, how to fix it. And we'll go into this again later and repeat it, but the same thing goes if a threat item isn't powerful enough. If it has no real impact on play, it has these seemingly cool abilities that just never come up, work with your players and be open and talk about how to fix it. What will make this fun without disrupting play. When you're using content you didn't design, you should absolutely alter the key knowledge and deeds to best fit your campaign and your needs. A lot of them are left vague, specifically to allow them to be inserted in your campaign. And even if they're too specific with the vague indications, change them entirely as you need. That includes you can adjust the effects to better fit your game and your power level, because not everyone's going to be at the same, or maybe an effect provided you like most of it, but one of them just seems like it's going to be useless. Change it. Make it something that will be useless that your players will like, because the idea here is to, have fun and use these to create plot hooks. So adjust anything that's needed to make a better plot hook and get your players involved. So some general thoughts, kind of reviewing what I've just said, is the goal here is to have threat items and their key knowledges and deeds serve multiple purposes. Pursuing key knowledge should never be wasted time, which is often the perception is that if I'm doing this key knowledge, I'm not doing the plot. They should ideally go hand in hand and use this opportunity as a game master, particularly in a Sandbox campaign, to know where your players are going and what they're doing, so you can have them be there for these certain events and have it all go together. And as your players are acting in any game, but especially a Sandbox game, you should be able to revisit your plans and update them, and update the map you have, even if it's just in your head as events unfold. How have things being affected from what your players are done, the outcomes, their decisions, even the reputation that sets things into motion. And if the world is reacting to them, not just they're these actors that act upon the world, it makes it feel more authentic and that their actions have repercussions, both good and, very important, bad. There should be consequences of all kinds for all their decisions and actions, as is incredibly important. Communication. It's difficult, but so important to sit down and talk to people as adults. I've personally had to learn that lesson multiple times, and it's often a hard lesson, but it's always good in the end to do so, even if it's difficult. And the agility to adjust on the fly as you need. I know my style is very plan-oriented and writing things down and getting ideas down on paper, but it's important to be able to adjust those on the fly as needed. So I don't go to exhaustive detail like a module, but I do have a very clear idea of how events have consequences of the outcome, and then adjust those as necessary. With the communication, listen to what your players are discussing at the table. If you have a difficult player, talk directly to them. Who knows what the answer might be? Figure out what's going wrong, what isn't working for them. They constantly try to derail your plans. Figure out why. Why are they deliberately essentially trolling you and trying to make life more difficult? There might be uncomfortable answers back there. I know I have at least one instance where I've confronted a player like that, and I found out that that's where they got their fun, was disrupting the game. We're still friends, but we don't game together like that anymore, because essentially that was just them being a shitty friend. And sometimes that's unfortunate, but it's the answer. And going back to threat items power level, if there's a problem, work to fix it openly. Open communication is so important. That doesn't just apply to threat items, but anything in play that's disruptive. If there's a spell that seems to be too powerful for the game and there's no errata or clarifications around it, and it seems, change it. Just talk with people before you do and get them on board with whatever the changes are going to be and how to approach them. So that is really all I have planned for this talk. I know it's pretty short, but I wanted to keep this more as a conversation and a dialogue to talk to other people. Let's see what kind of questions we have. Kyle wants to know if there's a good rule of thumb on key knowledges versus deeds. Is there such a thing as a deed that's too easy or too hard? And that is a good, interesting question. In some ways, the distinction between a key knowledge and a deed can be academic. A deed requires you to do something very explicitly, but at the same time, a key knowledge requires you to go learn this information. Deeds tend to be more open-ended in what you're asking someone to do, such as building a shrine or killing a horror. Now, if it's asking you to kill a specific horror, that's the same level of specific requirement as key knowledge, where you have to learn this specific information, you have to do this specific thing. The difficulty of the deed should generally be tied with the thread rank associated with it and the power level of the characters. If it's a trivial deed, that's probably too easy unless it's very flavorful and gets the players in the location you need. Like, you have to go to the city and provide an offering to this specific shrine. That's very easy, but it's convenient because it gets them where you need them to be, and this serves the purpose of the story. The thread item itself, in a very in-setting context, doesn't care about that, but you want them in this location, and that serves the story, and the events surrounding that deed are a challenge enough for the players, which is what's important, is they were challenged in getting this deed, even if the deed itself is a simple task. Josh asks, do I see any value in connecting multiple thread items to the same story elements or arc? Absolutely. That's a great point I failed to mention, is these thread items can be linked together. One of the more recent long campaigns I read, or I was running, one of the subplots was they were recovering the thread items of an old adventuring group and dealing with the problems that adventuring group left, essentially, for a later generation to figure out. So in recovering these thread items, they were slowly learning the history of what brought the events they were involved in to the point they were. And they were slowly realizing that these thread items were all connected together. And that by learning one piece of key knowledge, they might find a thread item that was linked to that, and slowly going forward, building this complicated web of story and history that they were piecing together. And sometimes it would take a little while to realize these pieces, similarly disparate pieces of information, and thread items were actually connected together. So Sebastian wants to know, well, first he says he likes to create thread items following certain themes. What are some of the more interesting themes I explored while creating thread items recently, and what do I still want to explore further? I explored a lot of effects building on each other, was probably the single biggest thing I went into, in that to describe in a little more detail. As you have one seemingly innocuous effect, it was usually spend a strain, get a +2 until the end of the next round, and then having the further later effects of that thread item build on that, so it was one much larger ability that was pretty integral to how that thread item behaved and what it did. And that was fun to do, to figure out the right balance for that. I'm not going to say it was always successful in figuring out the right balance, but I expect to do that more going forward. In how it worked out, I think it worked out very well in that it was pretty flavorful and emphasized some unique abilities of the thread items rather than just being a collection of bonuses. Giving some thread items some very creepy and weird personality was also amusing to me. I think the first item I went down that road with was the very useful gloves, which have their own little thing around them, though that's not always easy to do. Sometimes that's like capturing lightning in a bottle for getting just the right idea at the right time. I think the theme I'd want to follow the most is the thread items building on each other. Creating 2 linked thread items, I did that, and it is a lot of work. It's rewarding when you do it well and they work perfectly together, but getting there is a lot of effort. An example of that in published material is Smoke and Mirror. These are 2 linked thread items that you need to have both. It is a considerable amount of effort to get it just right. Rival asks, are you welcoming player suggestions as to what thread items they would want their characters to have, or do I hew closer to plan as a GM to hound out what you want to? That's an excellent question. I try and let players, how they play, tell me what they want. I'm certainly open to a discussion with players about what they're after, and if you have no idea what your player wants, absolutely have that conversation. Be careful though, some players, it can break their immersion to know you're handing this out specifically for them and you designed it for them. For me, my personal feeling is I like to see this as an opportunity of giving someone a gift in many ways, and gift giving to me is, here's how much I've paid attention to you to build this present for you, and how I've paid attention to what you want, and the details and my investment in your character are through this investment in this thread item I've made for you. That's not going to be the same for everyone. That's a very personal thing for how I like to do things. In some cases, the thread items turn out very weird. The Sinistral puppet from a previous game was an example of that, where the player himself loved it and loved how weird and awful it was, whereas the rest of the players lived in fear that it was going to kill them while they slept. So that was fun for me in a lot of ways. It also showed how the rest of the players were invested in this character's thread item, and that was fun for everyone. Kyle's asking, do you think thread items work better when they provide unique and new abilities, almost like knacks, or do you think they should focus more on powering up what a character can already do? Another excellent question from Kyle. I think having too many unique and new abilities can detract from what the character does. As while I like having thread items give these benefits and build on each other, if they offer too many, each one has this new ability that is a completely new ability for the character, rather than enhancing what they can already do in some way. It runs in the danger of stepping on another character's toes, encroaching on their niche. Then the character may start becoming about their thread items, whereas instead of the thread items being part of them and what they can do, it's about what the thread items are and what they can do, and what the character itself does is kind of secondary to that. I really don't like characters playing, second fiddle to their thread items, and characters building too much around these thread items.
Do you have a favorite thread item that you've done?
I think in a lot of ways Unrequited Wave is my favorite. It actually appeared in the Gamemasters guide, and it has a very melancholy story behind it. The effect the player absolutely loved. She was honestly a little upset that it got published because she viewed it as her very personal thread item. When she started uncovering the story behind the thread item, it made her a little sad because of the feelings that it evoked in her. I knew what her favorite movies were and some of her favorite books, and I exploited that to my advantage to connect her with the story of the things that happened in the past. So Sushi asked a question of Josh, but I don't know if that was directed at me.
I think it was just adding to my question.
Awesome.
because I sort of knew your answer, but you didn't mention it, so I wanted to prompt that discussion.
Thank you. That's excellent work, sir. I think it's called teamwork.
Finally, yeah, I was going to say, finely oiled machine over here.
Well, it's been a few years. 8 years? Are we going on 8 years now?
We are in our 8th year, I think.
Yeah.
Or thereabouts.
If this was a marriage, that would be beating the spread, I think.
Advantage is we don't live with each other.
Oh, that is factual.
Yet.
I don't think that's going to happen, Andy, no matter what your slash fix says.
You know, I actually had to look up what slash meant the first time I was told that because I didn't know what that was.
Well, Sebastian asks, what is the best thing the other has done for your personal work? Well, this isn't anything to do with thread items at all, or campaign.
But I think it's a great question.
Josh has made me be a better writer in a very real way, and have a little more faith in my work. All honesty, if he hadn't asked me, I never would have been here in the first place. It was in one of the newsletters, I told the story very briefly of it, and it was almost a giddy feeling when I got that email.
Morgan brings a whole dimension of system understanding. And I'm not talking necessarily just about Earthdawn, but just the interconnectedness of things. I always kind of felt I was decent at, but Morgan's on another level.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, it was actually kind of weird when we first started working together. I felt we clicked immediately. There's a lot of stuff we didn't agree on, which is as it should be. It was like working with someone who I'd been working with for much longer than I already had been.
Yeah, we both had the same end goal in mind and respected the perspective that the other brought to that destination.
Yeah.
I think the defining, like if I had to point to one moment for the definition of our working relationship is probably that Questor's brainstorming session at Gen Con.
Oh, yeah. Was that our first Gen Con together? No, it was our second Gen Con together.
Yeah, something like that. We didn't really get a whole lot of time to do a lot of face-to-face collaboration before that. That was, I felt like, the first one where we just found a somewhat isolated corner in the back of the Union Station hotel and just sat there in a couple of chairs and like for an hour and a half or 2 hours, just like, because I had very solid ideas already of kind of what I wanted to see, and we just like hammered at it. And that was actually the discussion where the solution to the devotion point problem came from.
Yeah, because I remember the first time we actually met in person was was it the Hyatt bathroom?
It was just outside the Hyatt bathroom. You were looking for the bathroom, and I was sitting there on a bench, like next to the skywalk.
Yeah.
I was talking with one of the Legends guys. I think might have been Kyle. I don't remember specifically who I was hanging out with at the time, but you like walked by and were like, "Hi."
I had spent an embarrassing amount of time looking for the bathroom. I was on the first floor in the most confusing hotel in the world. Any other questions, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I guess this has turned into Josh and I just hanging out.
Praising each other's genius.
Man, it's been a while since we've gotten to work together. I think in Mystic Paths, when we were sorting out specifically what to do with Purifier, how many pieces it should be broken into.
Oh, yeah.
Because there was almost a slightly different table of contents to that book, depending on how it worked out. There was another discipline in the works that got caught. I think the decisions and suggestions turned out for the best. K. Scott is asked, do you prefer any certain type of thread item? Weapon, armor, spell item, common item, etc. IFAN players, generally speaking, want to have a weapon. They want to have an armor. It can be useful to get those two items to them early, simply because of the associated costs for improving them with forging. So that's just a purely pragmatic, practical choice. And then from there, cloaks are very popular. People like to have a magical cloak, it makes sense because they're pretty cool. Cloaks, boots. I like to give players weirder thread items they don't necessarily want. Say like a house with chicken legs that will follow you around and grow into a much bigger house you can stay in the wilds. And then it does weird things after that. And maybe the person who owns it or previously owned it wants it back, and that's a complication on its own. In general, I like to give out more practical items and then tie the effects onto what that item does. I experimented with kind of giving offensive abilities to armor, mixing it up like that in my lengthy summer of thread items. In the end, I'm not a huge fan of what I did there. I know some people who got them really liked them, and that's awesome. But I don't necessarily think I would consider that a successful experiment for what I was trying to do. So Rival asks, since I've created 100 plus items, where do you find your inspiration for them all? What's the most obscure inspiration I've used? Inspiration can come from a lot of places. Things I've read is a big one. I mean, I can go back and I can find a thread item that was inspired by Samson poetry that's out there. The Tao Te Ching inspired a few, and actually there was a series of thread items I was writing that were all inspired by particular works from that. You know, Machiavelli and Sun Tzu are also good places for me to get inspiration. Edgar Allan Poe's work. Sometimes it's just my own peculiar sense of humor and what I think is going to be a great joke. There was a thread item pair was inspired by music. The Moonlit Toccata and Moonlit Crescendo were the two of them. It's a character wanted a lance and a bow that were linked together, and so I use those musical styles specifically to emphasize the percussion of the horse's hooves, the striking of a lance, and the plucking of the string of a bow. Kind of wove those together with one working towards the single attack of the other, and I thought that worked quite well. So, I mean, I wish I could give a good answer, but like most anything, it's whatever you see around you. Honestly, some of the hardest thread items to write are the ones where you start from a blank piece of paper, where you have nothing and need to create something from nothing. If you can get some point to start from, something like here's the character it is, and then here's the item itself, that can often work itself much easier than something completely random. You know, there are some that are completely random and from nothing in particular. But I usually like to start with a beginning and kind of an end point and then work out the middle from there. Maddie has enjoyed the handful of Australian-themed pop culture items. Well, that was what, True Blue, and there was one that was a reference to Waltzing Matilda. Thornbird is the third Australian-themed item. Well, I'm going to stop here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it. I really appreciate you listening here. I hope you've been having a great weekend, and thank you so much, everyone. Take care, and I hope the rest of the con is awesome for you.